Hello, this presentation was made by LCarr and Eduardo Silva on paramilitary groups in Colombia, an example of state right-wing terrorism, March 2022. I want to start by acknowledging that the land from which we are speaking today is traditional and unceded Quaid Musqueam and Central Coast Salish territory. First, I'm going to give you general information about Colombia. Colombia is located on the northwest side of South America, with a population over 51 million inhabitants. According to the Colombian Memories and Conflict Watch, since 1958, the armed conflict in Colombia has left 268,807 deaths. 18% of these deaths were actual fighters, and 82% were civilians. There are several responsible groups that are involved of all of those killings in Colombia. The first one is the paramilitaries with 94,754. The second one, guerrillas, with 35,683. Then the state agents, 9,804. Then ex-fighters, 5,188. Bandits, 2,445. And unknown groups with a number of 28,820. And unknown people, 35,778. Many groups are responsible of the war in Colombia, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on paramilitarism in Colombia. According to Tate, paramilitary groups in Colombia had evolved considerably since the 1960s, when the US started a strategy to help the Colombian armed forces to defeat leftist guerrilla movements. In the 1980s, political leaders, cattle ranchers, landowners helped drug traffickers organize paramilitary groups because they were tired of the extortion and kidnappings orchestrated by the guerrilla groups that also affected their cloudy businesses. Even former President Álvaro Uribe Vélez and his family, they formed paramilitary groups to protect themselves, businesses, and lands from the guerrillas. Guerrillas targeted drug traffickers and large landowners to support their group financially. However, the lack of protection from the government and the acceptance of forming paramilitary groups in Colombia created a snowball that killed and displaced a lot of innocent people. Many politicians face charges right now for supporting or obtaining benefits from paramilitary groups. For example, evidence has shown that the forces of Colombia helped paramilitary groups get information or to attack the population. An example of a terrorist attack against humanity perpetrated by the paramilitaries in Colombia is the massacre of April 2001, where more than 400 paramilitaries entered a remote jungle area in Colombia called Naya, where the inhabitants were primarily indigenous or Afro-Colombians. The paramilitaries accused the people of this area of aiding the guerrillas, and they started a mass killing that lasted over 3 days. A woman's abdomen was cut open with a chainsaw in front of everyone, and a 17-year-old girl had her throat cut and both hands amputated. It is estimated a range between 70 to 130 victims in that massacre, but exact numbers are still unknown according to the UN 2005. Right-wing terrorism. The paramilitary actions are a clear example of different types of terrorism, as terrorism is defined by the FBI as the unlawful use of force or violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government that government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. We also have state terrorism, where a government uses violence against its own population to eliminate dissent or to increase political power. And vigilant state terrorism, where is political violence that is perpetrated by non-governmental groups and individuals, where the overall goal is to violently preserve the preferred order or organize as paramilitaries into death squads, which is what happened in Colombia. So right-wing paramilitaries practice mala in se, political violence, which is immoral crimes. It became necessary to destroy the town to save it, according to them. The work between the Colombian forces and the paramilitaries is a clear example of government sponsorship. We found three types of government sponsorship in this case. Uh, Politically sympathetic sponsorship, which the government of Colombia openly embraced the main beliefs of the paramilitary cause. They covertly helped the paramilitaries, and the logistically supportive sponsorship, where the government provided aid and comfort to champion their cause, facilitating training, guns, and movement. And the episode-specific sponsorship, for example, in La Granja massacre in Ituango, Colombia, the army guards were moved from the town one day before the massacre that lasted 7 days, and they never showed up to protect the population. That work between the Colombian forces and paramilitaries to fight guerrillas and take control over territories, and the constant pressure from the government to boost body counts, resulted not only in several massacres and forcibly displaced people, but also at least 6,402 false positives or killings of civilians between 2002 and 2008. These killings were orchestrated during the government of former President Álvaro Uribe, and he has denied any wrongdoing.
The reason for these false positives boils down to government interests. The interests of the government at the time were to secure free trade agreements, and these were being looked at from the United States and Canada. These free trade agreements would have stimulated economic growth. However, another interest was to protect the partnership between the government and the paramilitary groups, as they acted as a security system for illegitimate trades that were occurring. An issue that arose for the government was how to show these countries interested in investing that the violence was under control and that their interests would be safe. How did they do this? Well, essentially, they falsified numbers of paramilitary killings to show these countries that they could get the issue under control. So, with that being said, around 6,400 innocent civilians were falsely labeled as terrorist groups and shown to be killed. These numbers were reported back to the countries who were looking to invest in hopes of instilling confidence in the country's ability to handle the terrorist situation. In the next slide, I will go over the second step that was taken, which was the demobilization agreement. The Demobilization Agreement of 2005. This occurred when the government at the time made a deal with the paramilitary groups. This deal sought to show other countries of prospective investors and civilians in the country that there was work being done to stop the violence. However, the optics of this were great, but when looking at recent numbers of civil rights activists who have been killed, it proves that this deal was only made to essentially cover up the relationship between the government and the terrorist groups. The terrorist groups, as previously mentioned, benefit from the violence, as does the government. So stopping this would essentially stop a stream of income from illegitimate trade. So the government wanted its income from fair trade agreements and also illegitimate sources, and without a demobilization agreement to show the prospective investors that they could get a hold of the violence in the country, they would not be able to secure the essentially second stream of income. So this demobilization agreement really only served the paramilitary, and members of the cabinet are now facing criminal charges for corruption. So as you can see in the recent numbers shown on this slide, the killings have not stopped since the demobilization agreement, and the country has continued to see massacres and social leaders being killed. These are people who are trying to speak out against violence and corruption in the country. In 2018, 298 social leaders and human rights defenders were killed, and this is a trend that is continued on up until 2022, where 28 massacres and 94 victims are shown to have been killed at the hands of the paramilitary and terrorist groups. In conclusion, Colombian resources attract foreign investments, and free trade agreements have supported these investments. However, the continuous terrorist actions and human rights violations are a current concern for many, affecting the economy and the relationship with other countries. As a consequence, many of the international companies are in Colombian territories, and they have supported paramilitary actions in order to protect their economic interests. And the paramilitaries continue to enable the companies to access areas of financial interest by displacing scores of people who had previously lived in the territories. Paramilitary groups in Colombia are no longer listed as terrorist groups by the US and Canadian government, but still they continue with their actions and enable foreign investors to acquire land and operate in the country. Both countries have supported the government in Colombia to fight drug trafficking, but they don't show much of interest in asking for results against paramilitary groups. So the goal now is to answer why there are no sanctions against the Colombian government for state terrorism, and why these groups no longer are listed as terrorists despite all the evidence and accusations.